So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about ancient DNA. And to give you some idea of the origin of this topic, I did the certificate and diploma in genealogical and paleographical and heraldic studies here at Strathclyde. Very long title, yeah. Some years ago, and 2 years ago, I had the pleasure of doing the master's leg of that programme. I did my dissertation on ancient DNA. So ancient DNA is essentially any DNA taken from things that are no longer living. So it doesn't have to be very old, just that once a person, an animal, a creature, a plant is dead, the DNA begins to decay very quickly. And therefore ancient DNA is a recovery of genetic information from deceased, formerly living entities. And so it's been very, very useful for archaeologists. It's very much associated with the scientific end of research into population genomics, movements of people around the world, and archaeology has been making great use of ancient DNA recently, including producing maps rather like this, showing here one potential model or version of how Europe was peopled in the Bronze and Iron Ages. This model suggesting there was large population replacement as peoples moved in from the east, and this is based upon evidence taken from burials of Bronze Age and Iron Age people around the continent of Europe, and it's turning upside down many of the conventional theories that archaeology had developed for many years beforehand. Now I'm not going to talk about this is obviously a very interesting area in itself, but I'm going to try and address here what use ancient DNA can be to the genealogist. So essentially ancient DNA, as I said, is DNA recovered that is rapidly degrading after death. It's highly fragmented. There's not very much of it, so it's very hard to recover, particularly the older the specimen. And contamination is a big risk, because if you're trying to take these very low amounts of DNA from archaeological specimens, there's big risks that it can be contaminated from your DNA, from the laboratory you're doing the work in, from the general environment, and you may end up getting contamination, misreads from modern DNA. And so a lot of techniques have been developed over the last 30 or 40 years. I think around 1983, I think, is when the technique was first developed, to try to make sure that ancient DNA really is reading the DNA of these ancient peoples. And this illustration here suggests that in modern cells you get long strands of DNA and the mitochondrial rings. These often tend to exist in ancient DNA. They're some of the easiest DNA to read from archaeological specimens, but you get much shorter fragments of DNA as the DNA breaks up and degrades. And a lot of it is taken from the teeth and the long bones taken from archaeological specimens. So long bones meaning the legs, the arms. But more recently it's been found that the best source of ancient DNA is the petrous part of the temporal bone, which is right here, behind your ear. It's essentially the housing for the inner ear. You see the map here in the skull, and the petrous part of the temporal bone is very, very solid, very dense. So there's lots of bone material there. You can shave off the outside and you've got better chances of getting original organic material from the specimen that belonged to the person in life, and therefore a chance of reading the DNA of the actual person you're trying to read. So techniques have been enhanced a lot over the last several years, and one thing that we're not going to get is Jurassic Park. So one of the great hopes in the 1980s of ancient DNA research was we can reconstruct the woolly mammoth, we can reconstruct the dinosaur. Woolly mammoths, possible. The last woolly mammoths died out about 40,000 years ago, and there are good reads of ancient DNA from mammoths. Dinosaurs, no. So it was eventually found that a lot of the ancient DNA read from supposedly dinosaurs in the 1980s was actually contamination from human or living creature DNA. Therefore, we're not going to get Jurassic Park. So, what can we get? Well, if you're interested in the population genomics and the archaeological side of the science, two excellent books are those by David Reich and Svante Pääbo, two of the experts who developed many of the techniques for recovering ancient DNA, and two excellent reads actually, speculating this one more about the development of the human species, the spread of people around the world. This one interested in the very personal crusade that led Pablo to read the first complete sequence of Neanderthals. Very interesting books, both of them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about not a species extinction, and I'm going to talk about genealogy. What can the genealogist do in this field? Is it just something that's very rarefied, or can we actually become involved? And there are many ways I think that we can, because a lot of these ancient DNA projects, some I'll look at shortly, looking at historical era people, are big team events. They're team research projects involving people with many different kinds of skills, from the archaeologist, the scientist, the interpretation, but we also need to know a lot about historical context. And if you're going to do serious ancient DNA work on historical era people, you need reference sequences. You need living DNA, modern DNA, to compare the results against that you're finding. So the archaeologist can, the genealogist rather, can do a lot of things involving genealogical research, finding living people, living descendants of potential common ancestors who may be able to provide useful reference sequences, target testing living relatives, but also investigating the historical context of the target person, when they lived, what historical evidence can be brought in to help interpret the DNA that's being read. And there's a lot of legal requirements. You can't just go and dig somebody up in the UK or Ireland or anywhere else. You're going to go through a lot of hoops if it's to be allowed at all. And of course, there are a lot of ethical and moral issues. There are people debating, for example, whether it's ethically correct to investigate the biohistory of, say, Abraham Lincoln, known to have certain medical conditions. Do we have a right, as modern people, to publicly open up to scrutiny Abraham Lincoln's medical history? Again, it's argued that the dead do not have rights of privacy because they're no longer persons, they're dead. However, we may feel that there are certain issues of taste and acceptability in how far we pursue some of these questions. So of course, I've got a few examples here then of historical era ancient DNA cases. These people have all, to some extent, been identified by using ancient DNA. Do you know who they are? You probably guess who he is. Yes? Yeah? Do you know who he is? So Jesse James. This is... not quite. That's not him either, no. That's Copernicus, the scientist. This one is Utsi the iceberg, absolutely, yeah. So obviously we don't exactly know what he was called in his life. We call him Utsi now, but the others we do know what they were called in their lives. So, to some extent, as I said, all of these have undergone some kind of identification. Copernicus, interestingly, there were several burials in Frombork Cathedral in Poland, one of which was believed to be him, but the archaeologists did not know which grave he was in. So they, no problem. So they DNA tested some of the likely graves, remains of these graves, and very cleverly they also DNA tested some hairs taken from a Bible that was held in Copenhagen. This Bible was believed to be owned by Copernicus, so that they were theorizing that those hairs in this Bible were Copernicus's hairs, and the mitochondrial DNA matched between the skeleton and the hairs. Now, I think with modern thinking and modern techniques of DNA analysis, we might say perhaps we need a bit more evidence than that. But it does seem to be reasonably compelling evidence that at least the grave they found could have been, very well could have been Copernicus's, especially as other graves tested did not match those hairs. So a reasonable case at least. Tutankhamun, I mean again there's a lot of controversy about whether we can get ancient DNA from mummies, particularly 3,000-year-old mummies. But the Tutankhamun and members of his family, his mother, his father, likely grandparents and uncles, have all been DNA tested, and ancient DNA has been extracted by an Egyptian team and published in quite reputable journals. And the genealogy that they propose from their DNA testing definitely checks out in terms of what else is known historically about Tutankhamun's family. So again, there's some reason to believe that actually this was a successful project. Jesse James, again, there's a lot of genealogical work involved in identifying living relatives, descendants of common ancestors, I think grandparents of James, to test and compare against two sets of remains from two different graves, all of which can match the common ancestors, and so the identification of those remains was actually quite convincing. Utsi hasn't been linked to anybody, but again, he has a whole sequence read, so all of Utsi's genome has been read, and it was actually one of the earliest full genome reads done in the ancient DNA field. So clearly, in some of these cases at least, there's a lot of work for historians and genealogists to become involved in investigating these questions. You all, of course, know about this one. Here he is, big bad Rich III. Has his detractors, bizarrely has his fans, not quite sure why, really, myself. But I mean, it's, you know, he's king of England for 2 years, and if you ask me, I think he did do what he's accused of having done. But somehow he seems to be one of these inspirational characters. I think this is the reason. I think Laurence Olivier created an image of Richard III that has persevered over the last 50, 60 years as one of the classic anti-heroes, villains, pantomime villains of history we all love to hate. But of course, the thing about Richard III was a lot of genealogical work went into the identification. And so, first of all, these living descendants were tracked down through the all-female line, very important, this, by some brilliant genealogical work. I put Professor Kevin Schurer here of Leicester University. I should also mention John Ashdown Hill, the historian who first identified Michael Ibsen, and then Professor Schurer then proved that Ibsen really was related to Richard and also found the second living descendant. And with the mitochondrial DNA from these people, these bones were found to match these two people, and this became compelling evidence to support the argument these were indeed Richard's bones. So this is the descent tree that Kevin Schurer identified. Michael Ibsen's descendant here from Richard's sister. Therefore, both Anne of York and Richard received the same mitochondrial DNA from their mother. Richard has no descendants. Anne of York has these two lines, all female mother-to-daughter lines, all the way down until you get to Michael, who received the same mitochondrial DNA from his mother. Most of Michael's ancestors are called Barbara, which is kind of interesting, really, and most of Wendy's are called Francis. Not quite sure why that is, but coincidences. And this then helped, here we have a map here showing how mitochondrial DNA is inherited down the all-female line, so mothers pass it to their sons as well. The sons never pass it on, whereas the daughters always pass it on to their sons and daughters, so you can track an all-female line down. And they try to do the same thing with Y DNA, which again is inherited in the all-male line in the same way. We've been hearing about Y DNA from Graham and Ali already. And unfortunately the Y DNA didn't work because who should have been living descendants of a common ancestor in the male line of Richard, that's Edward III, turned out to not match Richard's skeleton. So we have the 5 members of the Somerset family here, again with a genealogy that checks out, but it's known that there are at least a couple of places in this tree where the tree may break, where the actual believed transmission is not the same as the genetic transmission. And because we know that mothers will always know who their children are, fathers not necessarily, for reasons that I think we're all aware of, it's not surprising necessarily that over so many hundreds of years there could be breaks in the male lines. This wasn't taken to be good evidence that the bones were not Richard's. If they'd matched, that would have helped contribute to the image, the picture that they were Richard's. But it's important to understand that DNA on its own can't identify Richard, because even the mitochondrial DNA could be shared potentially with other people. We don't know how common that mitochondrial DNA pattern may have been at Richard's time. There could be other maternal relatives of Richard in the grave. The Leicester team believed that wasn't very likely, so they could calculate the odds or the chances that was Richard's unique DNA pattern. But there's added to other things known about Richard that match the skeleton, particularly the physical features that suggest scoliosis, the curvature of the spine, battle wounds, the right age. This skeleton was aged in his mid-30s. The dating fits the late 15th century, early 16th century. A seafood diet found somebody buried who was living inland away from the sea, suggests they must be wealthy in that period. So all these factors already began to add up to the likelihood this was Richard. And the mitochondrial DNA added on to about 478 to 1. That sounds very precise, but the statistical team calculated very precise odds of what each of these elements contributed to the likelihood of this being Richard. So, say 92% in favour of this being Richard. The Y-DNA evidence was actually a slight negative against being Richard's, but only a small one because, again, Y-DNA can have very common breaks in the line. And from this, the Leicester team concluded that we have odds of 6.7 million to 1 that the skeleton was in fact Richard's skeleton. I think quite convincingly identified as Richard III. And the important thing here is that all of this needs to work together. The DNA is strong evidence and compelling in some ways, but on its own it's not sufficient to certainly identify the skeleton as being Richard. And this is what, coming back to my original point, is of interest for genealogists and historians, because in order to accumulate this degree of evidence to make a compelling case for an ancient DNA study, we need historical research. So the scientists can do their side of the study, but good historians, good genealogists are needed to provide matching information, all of which can add up together to produce a strong argument. So, if you're interested in this, Professor Cleary King, who did the identification, the scientific work on the ancient DNA, gave a superb lecture in Berlin 3 years ago, and it's available online, and we can supply the link to anybody who's interested. This is the King's lecture, speaking in English in Berlin, very well worth watching as a good account of how she identified Richard. So, can we find a Scottish king in a car park? There was a yes, is there a Scottish king in the car park? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that I've been involved in. It's been going on for a couple of years. We're trying to find the money to move this forward. It's not going to be quite the same as Richard. First of all, the person we're looking at was never actually a king, though perhaps he was trying to be one. Someone else got there first, in rather brutal fashion. And this, of course, is the case of the Red Cummin, brutally dispatched by Robert the Bruce on the altar of the Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries in 1306. And in fact, the Bruce just injured him fatally. Then Kirkpatrick, the Bruce's colleague, said, "I'll make succor," and went back in to finish the Red Cummin off. And his uncle. The uncle is very interesting because it is claimed that the uncle has living descendants who are the Cummin Gordons, or Gordon Cummings of Aberdeenshire. So there may well be living descendants alive, which would make it easier to identify any remains. So do we have some remains then of the Cummin? Well, it's not a car park. There's a car park outside this, and the site goes into the car park. So we do have a car park element. But this is
tenuous.
Yeah, I know. Yes, but this is the Lennox's supermarket in Dumfries in 1900. I think this is 1930s possibly, or early 20th century. This was made. There's a Greg's shop in this building now. And the basement is closed off. I tried to get in there, couldn't get in, but the basement is still accessible if you speak to the right people. And in this photograph here we see site of altar, because the archaeologist who led this particular excavation in 1901 happened to be the supermarket owner. It's quite nice, isn't it? You've got your own supermarket. And also there was later a provost of Dumfries called James Lennox. And Lennox reported to the Dumfries Natural History Society, I'll come back to shortly, about a discovery of some bones. Now, there are some bones in Dumfries Museum, and here we see Andrew Millard, an archaeologist from Durham University and a specialist in ancient DNA, who was here examining this bone collection. And it was fascinating watching Andrew. I was there that day watching him do this, as he sorted out the animal bones to one side and the human ones, arranged them in, classified them by tight, long bones here, smaller ones there, and so on. And this was a preliminary analysis to decide whether these could potentially be bones of interest. And we need to do a full osteological analysis first before we can move on. But James Lennox, the archaeologist, who found some bones in 1901, gave two accounts of these, one to a local newspaper and one to a meeting of the Dumfries Natural History Society. And He talked about an excavation in that basement of his supermarket. I found a great number of human bones. The majority of those have been deposited in Mother Earth, so as they're buried originally. In no case were there remains of wood except one body of child. So lots of burials, there's lots of bones there. But he found some of particular interest that appeared to be buried in the kirk itself in a lay manner. So they weren't priests, they weren't clerics, and there were two of them buried close to the altar, which suggests these may be high status individuals. And so Lennox presented this to the meeting and speculated that maybe these were the bones of the Red Cummin and his uncle. And he was interrogated by the other attendees, and he ended by saying that he had kept the skulls of the two skeletons, and they were buried in a box and they could be obtained. The skulls were in good preservation. So it sounds like long bones, maybe not, but the skulls were in good preservation. Unfortunately, that's all we know about those skulls, because World War I comes along, Lennox dies during World War I, he has no children, no one knows where his family papers are, there's no further record of where he buried these bones. I suspect he probably buried them inside his basement, close to that sign that says Site of Altar. However, in the 1960s there were some further excavations, and that's what led to this collection of bones being in Dumfries Museum. We don't actually know if they're the ones that Lennox buried, or if other bones just happened to be found in that car park I mentioned earlier. So there are two skulls in reasonably good condition in this collection. One we think is probably a female skull, and the other one is almost certainly male, and has got certain evidence of what could be trauma, which Andrew was very interested in, possible marks of wounds. It's impossible to tell at first glance whether these are made by pickaxes or were actual wounds inflicted when the person was living. But there is this very interesting hole here, and again Andrew was saying that there is actually a medieval weapon that would make a hole like that. So it could be a modern tool, it could be an ancient weapon. He needs to examine it under a microscope, see what patterns of damage there are on the bone. So this could be the skull of a person who was killed by a violent assault of some kind, or of course it could simply be workmen just digging and creating more damage later. So what do we do? Well, we need a lot of research. We need to find living Cummings, if there are any, who can test against these. There are people claiming to descend from the Cummings. We can't quite join the genealogy up. That's one slight problem. And these are some of these Cummings. But that would be the reference sequence. We also need to examine these bones to decide how likely they could be to be medieval relics or from this right period. Then do dating, carbon-14 dating, to see if they are again of the right period. And ultimately, if everything checks out, then we can move to taking some DNA. DNA is destructive, so DNA testing is destructive, so you want to do it if you're sure you're going to get some kind of good result from it. Two more slides very quickly. Some of you may have heard about the Scottish soldiers in Durham. Again, Andrew Miller was also involved in this project. These were now believed to be skeletons of Scots prisoners of war captured in 1650 following the Battle of Dunbar. 18 or 20 of these were excavated in Durham in 2013, and Durham, although the bones have now been reburied in a local burial ground, they have moved towards taking ancient DNA from them. They've already done the mitochondrial DNA reads. Interestingly, 2 of these skeletons are found to be maternally related with a fairly rare mitochondrial haplogroup that suggests they may come from northeast Scotland around the Murray Firth area, possibly. And again, Durham is trying to raise more money to do more DNA testing, first Y-DNA testing, and ultimately some kind of whole genome sequencing. And back to what the genealogist may be able to get information in DNA, on a much more domestic front, there's a lot of interest growing in what's known as artifact testing, which is trying to get DNA from artifacts left behind by recent ancestors. At the moment, there are 3 companies, three companies who are either offering or preparing to offer tests on envelopes and stamps. So anything where saliva may have been deposited, there is a possibility that you can extract DNA from that. to the letter, probably leading the field here, an Australian company, and they will say very strictly they will only test if the person who may have licked those envelopes is known to be dead, and if we know who they are. They will not test any anonymous letters, they will not test anything that may lead to a living person, so if any poison pen letters you may have been sent, and who they are, so you can't use those. But if you have any letters that your grandmother may have licked the envelope of, then there's a possibility at some stage of getting DNA from that. Be careful, however, it's new technology, and the cautious among us are waiting to see how it develops, because if you only have 1 or 2 letters and current technology can't get the DNA from those, then you've lost them, they've gone forever. So maybe better techniques in future will be more successful in achieving this. If you have lots of letters, then maybe it's worth trying one. If you have anything you want to maybe one day think you can try and get DNA from, preserve it. Cool, dry, close away somewhere where people won't handle it to avoid contamination is the best way to approach this. And of course, big ethical questions again, back to what I said about Abraham Lincoln. These people are dead and they've never given any opinion about whether they want to be DNA tested or not. My grandmother didn't know what DNA testing was after all. Do I have the right to go and read her DNA 30 years after she died? So again, big questions to consider here. So that's a little overview of where ancient DNA may help the genealogist. Thank you.